Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's PMI Friday webinar, Data Collection Techniques with Marie-Clare Pedersen. My first time with Marie-Clare Pedersen. I cannot believe that we've been delivering these webinars for well over a year, or for nearly a year, and this is the first time we've worked together, so I'm very excited for this. I'm Susanna Clark. I'm going to be facilitating the session today, and that includes running all the Q&A desk. So we're going to be using that throughout the presentation. You can find the Q&A and the chat buttons on your Zoom control panel. Please do keep your questions coming, any comments you have, any observations you have, and I'll share them with Marie-Clare. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we're going to send you a link via email at the beginning of next week. So that will have the full recording of both the audio and the presentation. As usual, we're also broadcasting live on both Facebook and LinkedIn. So to those of you who are joining us on those live streams, we welcome you. In the future, if you want to participate in any of our polls and also to receive the recording via email, please do register for the webinars at pmi.co.uk/webinars. You can also send us any topics that you think you'd like us to cover through that. We'll be sending everyone who has registered a short voice of the customer survey at the end of the session today. We are always very, very grateful for your feedback and your suggestions for future topics. Thank you to everyone for your continued support and joining us for these webinars. And now I'd like to hand over to Marie-Clare.
Thank you very much, Suze. Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome, and thank you for joining me for this webinar. I trust that things are well for you wherever you are in the world. My name is Marie-Clare Pedersen, and I'm a senior consultant with PMI. Today, we're talking data collection, the method for effective data collection, some things to watch out for, and I'm also going to share with you some of my top tools for transforming data into insights. Fundamentally, data collection is simple. You either do it manually or you do it via some automation method. But without a method, your data will not be reliable, and without insight, your data won't be useful. Before we get into this topic in detail, I'd like to get a sense of why you are collecting data. So got a couple of answers there. So answer 1, to understand past performance, 2, to predict future performance, 3, to test theories on why processes behave the way they do, and an answer 4 for other. If you've got some other reasons why you're collecting data, please pop those in the chat window, and we can have a bit of a discussion about those. Now, this is a multiple choice poll, so you can select as many answers as you like.
So that poll is launched, and I can see lots of you are selecting your various answers. I've got the chat open, so please do share. If you're in the other camp, then do let us know why you collect data. That would be great through the chat.
Some interesting pattern happening at the moment.
Yes, indeed. So I'm just going to give that another 5 seconds, and then I will end that and share all the results so that everyone can see.
That's interesting. So 76% of our audience are collecting data to understand past performance, with only about just short of 60% predicting, 65% to test theories. I'm interested in the 9% for other. Did we get some responses there, Susan?
We haven't had anything through the chat window, but if something comes in, I'll let you know.
Okay.
So I'll stop showing those results, and Marie-Clare, if you need to see them again, just let me know.
Brilliant, thank you. That doesn't surprise me that actually the majority in this poll has come out as understanding past performance. Tends to be the focus of a lot of our data collection and a lot of our data analysis. And we're going to explore this a little bit further as we go through the webinar today.
We've had a late entry on the other, Marie-Clare, which I just wanted to share.
Yes,
it's a great reason, regulatory reasons.
Fantastic. Yes. Yeah, that in terms of other third parties, absolutely. So regulatory performance as well. So yeah, that's great. Thank you for that one.
And we had another one in to help develop new systems.
Oh,
That's
okay.
interesting.
That's a very proactive approach towards for data collection. Perhaps we can explore that one a little bit later as we're looking at this. How do we use data to look forwards as well as backwards? Thank you, everybody. The quote for this webinar came from Deming. In God we trust, and all others bring data. And if you couple that quote with this one, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. It gives us one of the biggest challenges we face on a day-to-day basis. People often place the same value on opinions as they do on data. And certainly the recent global health crisis has provided us with many examples of how opinions have been afforded the same value as data from experts, scientific experts with, over 40 years experience in their respective fields. Certainly in the UK, our Prime Minister has stated many, many times over the last 12 months that the decisions that were going to be taken by the government would be based and guided by the science, the data from the experts. But that hasn't stopped people wading in with their opinions. Classic one, certainly in the UK right now, was to wear a mask or not wear a mask, as an example of opinion versus data. And with the rise of social media influencers providing another dimension to this challenge, my question is, what data are they working with? Or are people affording value to their opinions? Something that we just need to be conscious of and watch out for when we're thinking about the data that we have around us, how we use it, how we interpret it. Because without data, we are going to rely on our instinct, speculation, our own opinions that have been formed by data that we do have around us. But it's not as simple as making decisions based on data, because if we've got the wrong data or we misinterpret that data, we may have the situation where actually we might have been better off with our opinion, knowing that it wasn't backed up with data. So a question to you, how often do you act on data or data that supports your opinion? Or indeed, are you acting on an opinion without the backing of data? Making a decision based on data doesn't solve the whole issue. I'm sure you'll have all experienced a situation, and certainly those of you who have experienced Deming's red beads experiment will have witnessed the red beads manager making decisions based on data, but those decisions not making sense. And that's because the analysis of the data has been done independently of the knowledge of the process. Yet this happens a lot, and making interpretation on data without the knowledge of the process from which it has come can lead us into all sorts of challenges. So why do we need to collect data? There is data all around us in everything we do. It exists even if we're not collecting it. But the challenge is there's no value in simply collecting data. Value is only realized when we make sense of it by transferring it into insight and then taking action. Data collection without analysis and subsequent action will only result in cost without any benefit. We're going to invest time, effort, resource to do that data collection. In order to get the benefit from it, we have to first turn it into insight and then take action. If we take action on the data without understanding the insights, again, we may take the wrong action. So how many of you have in your organizations have data warehouses? And how much of that data is currently analyzed to provide insights? And then how much of it is actually acted upon? What are the costs of gathering and storing data and managing these huge data warehouses? If you want to understand a bit more about that one, come and join us next week for Rich Seddon's webinar, where he's actually going to be talking about big data and looking at how we can simplify the concept of it and focusing on the practical ways to enhance improvement efforts using big data. Be clear on what it is you're trying to accomplish. Collecting data before we know the question we're trying to answer can get us into all sorts of complications. One organisation I worked with had a team of accountants who every month produced a hefty management report. It took 2 weeks to actually compile, and it was based on the data that had been collected throughout the previous month and analysed. One of the copies of these reports went to the production manager, and in a conversation I was having with him, I actually asked him, I said, what do you do with this report, this management report? And then he pointed to the recycling bin. So when I asked him, why is that? His reply actually stuck with me and has stuck with me to this day. What good is it to me to receive a report 2 weeks after the end of the month based on data that was 4 weeks previous? So I need data that's going to help me today. So the question that has stuck in my mind ever since that time was, we have to establish what it is we're trying to accomplish, then identify the data that we need to create those insights to be useful and helpful and beneficial to our customers of that data and of that analysis. Before we can think of having a robust method, we need to consider the principles that sit behind our data collection. Where in our system is the data generated? How is it captured, recorded, validated, stored, refreshed, summarized? These are all things we need to consider. Do we understand the journey that the data has been on before it gets to us? How much data cleansing has gone on? In one UK hospital trust that I was doing some work with, they were looking at improving patient journey. And we actually started by looking at the data that was being provided to this improvement team. And what we identified was there was a huge amount of data cleansing happening before that data got to the team. It was done with good intention, but it didn't allow us to understand any material issues with that data. What were the things that we needed to be aware of? How well does our data reflect the variation? What rules have been put around our data collection? Is the data rounded up, rounded down? Is the data only collected within certain parameters? I had a situation in one manufacturing company where the data was only recorded if the product was within specification. If it was out of spec, the product didn't get a barcode. So as a result, none of the data was recorded. Now, it was a great mistake proofing approach because the product couldn't continue down the production line. But unfortunately, it meant we had no data as to why the product was rejected in the first place. What are our theories for our data collection? Are we looking for data to support conformance or data to test non-conformance? Are you only providing data that shows that your product or your service conforms to specification, to standards? What's happening to the data that tells us the other half of the picture, that tells us about what happens when we're not meeting those requirements? And linked with this, what assumptions do we make about the knowledge that we have and the data and the influence on data collection? What are our own biases towards a situation, both consciously and unconsciously? What is driving our data collection behavior? Are there personal consequences potentially taking priority over the bigger picture? Are we guilty ourselves of inadvertently screening or cleaning data and making judgments on that data without an objective supporting analysis? So we need a method for data collection. And data collection is a process. As a verb noun, collect data. And with so many of our processes, our focus is often on the output. But again, like all of our processes, the quality of the output is in itself dependent on the quality of the inputs. So careful consideration for each of the inputs is required. And the process itself needs to be clearly and effectively documented. I spent hours observing operational areas in multiple types of business sectors, and something I see common is people collecting data without understanding why they're doing it. Understanding what will be done with the data, the implications if data isn't accurate or missing, having the right materials and equipment to be able to collect the data, having a robust method with the appreciation for the environmental factors is absolutely crucial for an efficient and effective data collection method. In a manufacturing location where I was supporting a team with some improvement, the operator was measuring and recording the weight of a product. The scales were measuring to the nearest tenth of a kilo, which didn't give sufficient resolution to the part-to-part variation of the weight of the product. And on observing the process, we could actually see that the scales themselves were fluctuating when there was nothing on them. When we took some further time to have a look at what was happening, we noticed that there were fans overhead that had been installed to keep the area cool. So all the data that had been recorded about the weight of this particular product was in question because of the environmental factors and the method for collection. Nothing to do with the operator themselves, but the method by which they had been tasked with collecting data. So these are my key considerations for collecting data. We need to think about the purpose, the risk, and the source. So let's have a look at these in a little bit more detail. So purpose, what questions do we have? There's no shortage of data around us. And this is the case in our organizations. It may not always be accessible or in a useful format. Talked about, reliability and completeness, but it's there. Before collecting data, though, we've got to establish what questions it is we want to answer. The type of question asked will influence the method of analysis, and therefore it's actually going to influence the type of data that we need. It boils down to two things. Do we want to summarize the past, or do we want to predict the future? Both types of analysis are required to manage our processes effectively, but you need different tools and do different studies for the two situations. Question to you, what proportion of your data analysis is predicting the future? Got a bit of insight from our data collection poll earlier in the webinar, that actually the bigger proportion is actually looking backwards rather than looking forwards. Which would suggest that the resource that we invest in, our business analysts, our data analysts, are spending the majority of their time summarizing what's already happened. And I remember on a Greenbelt training I was delivering a couple of years ago, I had some delegates from one particular business who were all business analysts and data analysts for their business. And one of them said to me, we can analyze as much data as they want, but actually we need to tell them what it is they're interested in. And that was their biggest takeaway from the Greenbelt training, was that actually they needed to start with the question. Turning our attention to risk. A sample refers to a set of data, drawn from a population, it's very, very unlikely that you will be able to analyze every last single bit of data in the population. And therefore, all of the analysis that we do is based on a sample. So to be useful and provide accurate insight, that sample needs to be a true representation of that population. And to ensure that sample is a true representation, you've got to have some knowledge of what the potential sources of variation are with the subject that we're interested in. Our sampling strategy with the sweets here, if we took all of our data from one jar, we're actually going to miss the variation of the sweets in the other jar. So we need to be thinking about our sampling strategies and how we combine various sampling strategies to give us the best possible picture of what is going on when we do our analysis. There will always be a degree of error in our sampling, and as sample size increases, sampling error decreases. So if we want our data to serve as the basis for action, we need to be confident that our action is based on sound data collection methods. My guidance, if in doubt, collect more data. And if it's not possible to do that, be mindful of the risk that your conclusions may not be based on a sound representation of the population. Inappropriate sampling strategies and sample size is my number one on my list of how to lie with statistics. When auditing, I will always look at the sample size, sample strategy, frequency, methods as described in a business's control plan, because that gives me initial insight into how well a business is using its data to help them make decisions. I see it's a question.
Well, it was an observation, really, because I think sampling is really interesting, because I think that for those of us who know better, I include myself, or as I used to be in that camp, you know, the inclination is that it's actually not sampling. What we have to do is check. And I'm reminded of a situation. We in PMI, we published a book a few years ago, and the books all arrived. There were a lot of them. They were all in boxes, and we were sending them out to clients. And after, you know, a large number had been sent out, we had a response back from one client who said, "Did you know there are 3 chapters repeated?" And suddenly, of course, we started to doubt ourselves, and I started to think, oh my goodness me, and run around thinking, oh my goodness, I've got, you know, 2,000 books I've got to look through to find out, you know, how many of them have got this problem. And fortunately had a wise black belt in the office who introduced me to the concept of sampling rather than checking, which was a godsend. And actually it sped the whole thing up hugely, and we were able to really identify actually how big the problem was. I feel a session on sampling for the future coming on, I have to say, Marie-Clare.
Absolutely, I agree with you. It's interesting you mention about checking versus sampling, and if you were to look at the majority of what you do within your organization, my theory is that it's going to sit in the checking camp as opposed to the sampling. And then say, yes, there's a whole webinar at least plus masterclass to come in terms of the content of sampling. Absolutely. I can say it's my number one on how to lie with statistics, and you may not be doing it knowingly, and that's the challenge. So some key questions to consider for your sampling plan. How are you going to analyze the data? How available is the data? Because that's going to be a real driver as to, you know, your sample size. What's the cost of collecting that data? You know, if it doesn't already exist, you've got to factor in the fact that you've actually got to collect it from scratch. The rule is the more variable your process is, the more data you're going to need to be representative of that variation. And if your process is not stable, then again, you're going to need more data to be representative of the true performance of the process. Second aspect in terms of risk, is the data accurate? Not distorted by your measurement system. And if anybody's doing a quick conversion to Celsius, that's so 505 degrees Fahrenheit is 262 degrees Celsius. That's about gas mark 10 on your oven. Most foods are cooked at about gas mark 5. So if out on the street, wherever this sign is currently 505 degrees Fahrenheit, you're not going to be around for much longer. One of the most bizarre situations I experienced in distorting data by the measurement system was a location where they had an outside platform scale, so it was set into the ground, but it was about sort of 6 to 8 inches above the ground, and they couldn't understand why suddenly everything that they were weighing was a lot lighter than it should be, until we went and had a look. And there was a scaffolding pole that had that somebody had obviously put up against the wall, thinking that was a good place for it to be, and it had rolled underneath the scales. So it meant that the scales could actually only compress to the level of the scaffolding pole. We operate in global environment where one of the biggest challenges to time-based data is differences in time zones. And then certainly add in the challenges of changing the time back an hour, forwards an hour, depending on whether you're coming in and out of summertime, causes us quite a big challenge when we're looking at that sort of data collection. And operationally defining start and end times for our data collection is absolutely crucial for making sure our data is accurate. As soon as I see on a data collection sheet, record the time, that's going to actually lead me to delve deeper into that particular process step. What is it? Why? How are they recording it? What measurement device are they using for that? And is it accessible to them? I've seen situations where on-time delivery is an absolute crucial measure. So who's responsible for recording the arrival time? Is it the delivery driver? Is it the customer? What device are they going to use? Is it customer's watch, the driver's watch? Is it the clock, on the wall? All these things need to be taken into consideration. And of course, there are some great technology advances now that have overcome some of those challenges. What we have to recognize is they come with a cost, but actually is the benefit of having the accurate data much more of benefit than the error that we might be having. Data based on opinion gives us probably the most difficult challenge in terms of accuracy. In a lot of organizations, visual inspection is a big part of data collection. Who's collecting that data? Is it independent of the person who actually operated the process? So is somebody checking somebody else's work? Understanding natural variation, that some people may be more critical than others. Bringing into consider the environmental factors. So location, culture, age, experience, all of these things come into play when we're capturing our data. So my key here is you have to go and see. You have to go and observe the measurement processes. As with any process, you must go to Gemba. Third aspect on risk is the data complete. How will you know if data is missing? So it's never usually as obvious as an empty field in a database, or in my situation, empty slide in my webinar. How are you going to handle missing data? What assumptions do you do currently? And how do you go about dealing with that missing data? What assumptions are you making about that missing data? So if we were to consider a customer satisfaction survey, and we've sent this out to 100 people, and we've got 40 returned to us. Generally, anything over 50% return rate is considered excellent. And it suggests that you've got a high level of motivation in that audience. And that motivation could be because they've had great experience, or they've had horrendous experience, or they have a belief that by giving feedback, it's actually going to be able to change a result for that. So, well, what do you do then? What do you assume about, in this case, the other 60 customers who haven't responded? Are they sitting in the middle? And what's that risk of making those assumptions? At what point does missing data materially alter the analysis that we're doing, and therefore the insights that we have? One rule of thumb is that any variable should be excluded if your analysis is, from your analysis, if there's about 15% or more of that data missing. But that's just a rule of thumb. You need ideally to have the process knowledge and the process experts who will be able to validate whether the picture that you're creating with the data is reflective of the situation and of reality. I was looking at hospital admissions and the length of stay of patients for a particular hospital. And when we looked at the data and started to analyze the data, the histogram that we created had this huge, great long tail on it. When we went back to the data and had a look at the data, so what we were doing, length of stay, was your discharge date minus arrival date. What we found was there were about 5,000 entries that were missing a discharge date. Now, for some patients, that was because they were still in the hospital, but it was materially changing the analysis that we had, and we had to report average length of stay. So when they were using the mean average as well, it was a complete distortion of reality. So not only was the analysis interpretation not quite right, the incomplete data was massively skewing the insight that we believed that we had to start with. Where does your data come from? What sources do you have? And what type of data do you need, or indeed do you have to hand? So in statistics, the validity of the output of some analysis depends on assumptions that are made about the data type and the shape. Do you have numerical data, something that you can measure on a scale? Now, this should be our go-to data because it allows us the opportunity to understand more about variation, and there are far more tools and techniques that allow us to analyze this type of data. However, our data might be some kind of count. Therefore, so we're counting an attribute of something. It could be number of customer complaints. Now, this type of data is useful, but it doesn't help us about scale or magnitude or variation within that. So again, it comes back to the question that we're interested in. What is it we're trying to answer here? Is it that we are interested in complaints relating to late deliveries? In which case, measuring the deviation between supposed arrival time and actual arrival time will give us variable data, which can be much, much more powerful in helping us to understand not just past performance, but understanding what that might look like as future performance if our process continued to operate in that way. Are you using ordinal or ranking data? And this is often associated with surveys, because we need to be really careful about how we treat this type of data. There are so many other factors at play. And certainly if you are working with survey data, you have a look at a masterclass that I deliver in terms of understanding survey design, survey analysis, and how we can better interpret the data that we have through a better design of surveys. Now, it could be customer surveys, employee engagement surveys, anything where you're trying to gather an opinion about how somebody feels about something. We shouldn't discount data, though, that presents itself as words. And it's a key way of strengthening the insight into ordinal data, actually. And I mentioned at the start about value of data over opinion. But often opinion is our starting point. It's our study zero. What is it these people are saying to me, and what are the theories as to why that might be? So a robust data collection method will consider all these types of data, both the benefits and their limitations, and a structure of a collection plan that provides the best solution for what it is we're trying to accomplish. In terms of where has our data come from, where in the business system has your data originated? Or indeed, has it come from outside of your immediate organization? Are you collecting data from your suppliers, your customers, competitors, regulators? Have you outsourced your data collection to a third party? Consider some of the things I've already mentioned about bias, variation, theories. How easy is it for you to get to the source of your data? How far has your data traveled before it's actually arrived with you? So in summary of my key considerations for collecting data, what's the purpose? What are you trying to accomplish? What is your theory? In terms of risk, how precise does your answer need to be? How sure are you that it is accurate? How sure are you that it is complete? And just a word of caution, don't confuse risk with uncertainty. Frank Knight described the difference between the two. Risk is when probability of an outcome can be calculated. Uncertainty is when the probability of an outcome is not possible to determine. Be careful when you use the word risk. Are you using it because you have a calculated probability? Or actually, are you really referring to being uncertain? And consider your sources of your data. What type of data are you using? Where has this data come from? How is it gathered, documented, and stored? Time for you guys to do a little bit more work then. So another poll for you. Where do you collect your data from? So another multiple choice poll. Answer 1, you've got manual sources. 2, machines. 3, robotic process automation, those types of approaches. Surveys is answer 4, and we've got other as answer 5. And again, if you've got other ways that you collect your data, it'd be great to hear about those in the session, in the chat window, please.
Thanks, Marie-Clare. So yes, that poll's been launched, and thank you for those of you who started to cast your or share your answers with us. If you do have another, then please feel free to pop it in the chat window so that we can look at that and talk about that as well.
We've got a couple of others.
There's always a few others around. Okay, I'm going to give you another 5 seconds and then I will end polling and share it with everybody.
Excellent. So we've actually got a really good split across there. So yeah, manual sources still at the out in front, and I'm seeing a significant shift certainly over the last few years, but there's still a huge amount of manual data collection happening, and we're going to explore this shortly. So yeah, surveys, absolutely. One of the things that we think on the surface, it seems quite simple and straightforward, to collect data through surveys, but it is actually fraught with quite a lot of challenges. And great to see, moving towards machines and RPA as well. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
One of the things for consideration with your data collection method is, are you collecting data for the short term for a very specific purpose, or are you looking for more longer term data collection so you can build that picture over a much longer time period? So when I'm thinking about short-term data collection, that's sort of data required for, as I said, specific purpose, often needed to test quite specific theories, potentially on the root causes of variation, where we may not historically have gone down to that level of detail, or it may not have even been a consideration in the past. Therefore, the data doesn't currently exist anywhere. Short-term data collection also should be consideration when we're looking at the design and pilot phase of new products or services, and we're looking to introduce those. I was on a project with a first-tier automotive supplier on a part that had 40 welds, and we needed to collect data to build a picture on the strength and durability of this part. And understand, what was happening with the weld integrity on these 40 welds. Initially, the process operators were given this sheet and asked to write down by name each weld that had failed. You can imagine how accurate that data and complete that data collection was. So we trialed a couple of different methods with them, and the one that worked well for them and gave us the best picture, literally the best picture, was we actually used the technical drawing, which had all of the welds identified on it. And each time they checked the part and one of these welds had failed, they actually circled it. So we were able to look at this. Going back a few years now, there are ways of perhaps doing that now in a less manual way, but it worked for us, and it showed that duration, that approach, that actually we needed to test the theory, study the result, and then adapt our data collection approach to suit the environment and the inputs that we were looking for as part of that process. Long-term data collection, for me, the key consideration here is sustainability. We've got to consider our data collection long-term as part of the overall process, product or service design. It shouldn't be something we think about as an afterthought. It needs to actually be considered as part of the upstream process. When you're paying £3 million for a piece of kit or equipment, don't skimp on the £20,000 data recording package that will collect and record crucial data about machine performance. Believe me, trying to manually record or even capture, let alone record temperatures, pressures, material throughputs, it's incredibly challenging to do that manually, and the level of accuracy and completeness really does call into question about the validity of that data. Also don't make assumptions about what your kit and equipment is capable of doing. You may need to have to go and find a 3-inch floppy disk from somewhere to download the data, but your kit and equipment may have that functionality. If it doesn't, think about how you can feed this into your upstream processes for future purchasing considerations. How that the importance of data collection is critical to the long-term process performance and effectively what your output is to your customers. So thinking about a few of the methods that exist to us, certainly when we're looking at short-term data collection, it may be that a manual method in the short term is the most appropriate due to cost and availability and resource. Some of the ideas there. Certainly long-term data collection, we should be looking at some form of automated method. What I will say though is whether you are collecting data in the short term or the long term, your strategy, your method has to be effective, efficient, and adaptable. And that certainly is a consideration for certainly designing automated data collection methods, is that you're starting with a theory. You're going to need to be able to adapt that data collection method as your theories evolve. A couple of things to watch out for to bring this webinar to a summary. Choosing the right data set. We need to be conscious of our own assumptions and make sure that our data collection is a learning process. Everything is based on a theory, but we need to challenge our theories, challenge our assumptions to ensure that we are actually getting the outcome that is the right outcome for what we're trying to accomplish, but without the biases that may be surrounding that. In his book, Fourth Generation Management, Brian Joyner explored 3 ways to get better results. And for those of you who joined me a couple of weeks ago on the measures webinar, we delved into this in a little bit more detail. But here, I just want to draw your attention to point 3. Distort the data. This can be conscious or unconscious. And as I mentioned, sampling strategy and sample size absolutely can be a key way of distorting the data. And absolutely, we're probably doing that unconsciously. More conscious distortion of data, and I mentioned a few weeks ago, the vehicle emissions challenge, global challenge that's being faced right now. Things like rounding data up and down, building excessive inventory, things like that can help to distort the data. What data do we leave in and what data do we leave out? If we leave the data out, does that tell us that we didn't fail on something, or it just tells us that the measure isn't reflective of the data that we have? When considering our data collection, data may be more difficult to collect if it's previously been used to reward or punish, if decisions have been continually delayed because we need more data. And of course, this is sort of a bit of a conflict then with the sample size and sampling strategy. But again, being able to say, inform people that we're starting with a theory and we may need to collect more data before we can make a decision. The example with the management accounts, a huge amount of effort went into both collecting that data, analysing it and presenting it, but it wasn't acted upon because it wasn't done in a timely manner. Are the data that we're collecting the result of someone else's inspection? And how does that influence the psychology of the team members involved? We had a situation with a supplier where everything that came in had to be 100% inspected. Back to Susie's point, it was checking rather than a sample inspection. The supplier had to pay for that. We had to host the people on site with that. So actually the only people who were winning in that relationship was the third-party inspection company. So the question I raised and we had to explore in that process was, how do we ensure that the inspection is actually valid? And how do we ensure that there's no bias as a result of the fact that this is a third party? What the benefit they got was the longer they were on site, the more they got paid. How do we actually manage that relationship with that third party? And of course, if people are already suspicious of the data and how it's being used and how it's being presented back, then of course there are going to be some potential barriers that we need to overcome. So data is needed to generate information to help with our decision-making processes. As human beings, we're constantly taking in data from around us, we're analysing it, we're making our decisions. It's not enough to just have data, because data on its own doesn't help us move forwards. We've got to actually translate that into insight. So these are my core tools for transforming data into insight. And they sort of fall into three categories. The first being understanding process performance, both historically and also going forwards. And when I'm thinking about process performance, I'm thinking about how my processes are in terms of stability, where they perform on average, so the center, how much variation is going on with them, so that's the spread, and also starting to formulate some theories as to what might be causing those in terms of some of the categorization. So things like, is it by different locations, by different machines, different parts, different customer queries, different patient types, those sorts of aspects. And the tools I'm looking for and using there, things like my control charts, my histograms, box plots, and also Pareto charts. Second one is I'm thinking about relationships in terms of insights. Do I have relationships between my data sets? And there I'm using regression analysis. The third one is I'm interested in differences. And then I'm using my hypothesis testing for differences in center, differences in spread, differences in categories. So taking, moving Pareto analysis onto the next level, looking for those statistical challenges. My advice is avoid using pie charts and straight bar charts. They don't often give you the greatest picture. So think about what it is you're trying to accomplish. And of course, you do need to think about your audience. And the last thing I'm going to do is start putting outputs from hypothesis testing in front of people who don't understand what that is. So again, I have to be thinking about my interpretation, but also how I translate my insight to others so that they understand as well. So in summary, technology has afforded us the ability to collect and store mountains of data. Business and data analysts spend their lives plowing through data and trying to make sense of it, trying to find the key. And now we also have AI and automation doing similar things. We still need intelligent interpretation from those who understand the processes from which the data is generated. So stay on top of your data, don't get buried in it, and only use what you need. And in summary of the key points that I hope have come across this afternoon, be clear on what you're trying to accomplish before you collect the data. Remember that data collection is a process in itself and therefore has a series of inputs that need to be carefully considered for a robust process. Your sample must be representative of the population in order to draw robust conclusions from your analysis. And when you're drawing those conclusions, ensure you have the knowledge of the process from which that data has come. And finally, data collection is a learning process. Therefore, use PDSA to test your data collection theory before, during, and after your activities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marie-Clare. That was excellent. And thank you for those of you in the chat for saying that that you found it very insightful. We really appreciate your feedback. It's great.
Thank you.
Just before we close the session, I mean, if you've got team members who you're looking to ask them to collect data, don't forget our all new Lean Six Sigma Online Yellow Belt is available. It's a great place to start and perfect for team members to understand more about why they are collecting data for you. Also, please do look out for our Voice the Customer survey. You're going to receive it shortly from us. We're always really interested in your feedback. It helps us understand our performance, and it also helps us to generate our theories on what topics should we cover in the future. So please do take your time if you can to fill that in. We'd be really grateful. And that brings us to the end of today's webinar. We look forward to seeing you in May, where we've got a great schedule lined up. For any of you who are interested particularly in data collection and thinking about big data, as Marie-Clare said, we're covering that topic next week. So all that remains is for me to say on behalf of PMI, for Marie-Clare and for myself, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to see you. I wish you all a very safe and a very relaxing weekend. Thank you very much.
All the best, everyone.